Not much is known about the entity, its weaknesses, its intentions. In fact, most of all that surrounds the entity is shrouded in mystery. This creature that controls the realm of torture that we play in Dead by Daylight seems to have no immediate goal besides feeding off the hope of the various survivors doomed to be locked into its realms. To help it harvest and collect this hope, along with the survivors, it brings beings attached to great travesties. Psychopaths, the mentally disturbed, and those who have been dealt a bad hand and been forced into torturous experiences which have twisted and snapped them. Each different, each of their own backstories and motivations. Which bodes the question, why do these people choose to follow this eldritch being that has forced them into an endless cycle of killing, maiming, and sacrificing for its own benefit? For the killers of Dead by Daylight, just like the survivors, are trapped, unable to escape their fate, and forced to play this game. In this video, we will be picking apart the reasonings of why the killers of Dead by Daylight choose to serve the entity, and the methods used to keep them in line. So far, several clear methods have been shown that the entity could use. Torture and punishment, its most favorite method. Incentivization for those who choose to be obedient. Locking them into contracts that seal them into work. The killer's own surprising willingness to comply with the entity. Threats to keep them in line, and simply waiting back and letting the killers come to their own conclusion that they are forced into servitude. Each method affects the killers in different ways, each for different reasons, but so far, all have been proven to be effective. So let's dive in and see just how depraved and malicious this being can be. Torture and punishment. We currently know this as the most consistent, or at least the most frequently used, methods that the killers are forced to comply with. Some killers tend to fall under this bubble for various different reasons. However, the effect in the end stays the same. Complete control. So let's start with the most noticeable case, the mascot of Dead by Daylight, the Trapper, or Mr. Evan McMillan. Currently the most noticeable example of the entity's torturous persuasion methods. By design alone, you could tell that Mr. McMillan has been through physical torment, deep cuts, sharp hooks protruding from his body. Evan McMillan idolized his father. It wasn't just that he was the heir to a great fortune, it was the way he ran the estate. Raised under his firm hand, Evan had taken to running the workforce with an iron hand. Production was always high, and the McMillan estate prospered under father and son. As Archie McMillan's mental health slowly degraded, Evan protected him from the herd who wanted a piece of his fortune. No matter what his father asked of him, Evan would do. When Archie McMillan finally snapped, Evan became his enforcer in what would be known as the worst mass murder in modern history. However, after Evan's disappearance, his father's was another unsolved puzzle, trapped, locked in the basement of his own warehouse, starved and abandoned. Evan McMillan had already abandoned the one he idolized and took orders from. So it's quite evident that Evan is clearly not the type to be taking orders from some random being. So simply refused to do what he did not want to do. However, in this place, actions like that don't go unpunished. The next step on our list, and the second most notable victim of the entity's torture, the Doctor, or Mr. Herman Carter. With the confirmation that his face enhancements were the entity's doing and not his own, a punishment for refusal to work. We could assume that his reasonings for being tortured, just like Evan, was not complying. However, I don't think this was due to genuine stubbornness or refusal to follow orders like Evan. What we learned about Herman Carter is that his research is incredibly valuable to him, to the point that he turned everybody in the Memorial Institute into vegetables or outright killed them with his experiments. That goes without saying to what he did to his mentor in his study for mind control. Carter's experimental information extraction had turned into horrific and bizarre torture. Patients and prisoners were found dead or in vegetated states with all types of head trauma. In his office, they found the most terrible discovery of all, Mr. Stamper himself. His head peeled open with an array of sensors and electrodes inserted into his still working but annihilated brain. There was no sign of Herman the Dr. Carter, but his research papers suggested that he had been using the prisoners as part of awful ECT experiments as he searched for the panacea of mind control. However, the government didn't want to know. The black site was condemned and all knowledge of Larry's Memorial Institute was redacted forever. It's clear that a man like this would care more about his experiments and his research than being the puppet to the entity, walking around sacrificing, twatting survivors over the head with an instrument of punishment. Didn't seem particularly high on his list of priorities. However, the entity showed him, like with many others, where his priorities should lie, and that is obedience in its every word. Finally, we move on to the two least noticeable victims of the entity's torture, but confirmed victims nonetheless. The nurse or the wraith, or if you would, Sally Smithson and Philip Ojomo respectively. Unlike our previous two, these two were not stubborn in their refusal to follow the entity like Evan McMillan, or even had more priorities to follow like Herman the Dr. Carter. These two and their faults and their reasonings for being tortured seem to delve around compassion. As seen in the nurse's Maury, she shows compassion for those that she has killed. Maybe too much compassion for the entity's liking, choked on mud and suffocated by a pillowcase. These are the fates that list these two. For the entity doesn't care even if you put in results. If you are fleeting in these results too much, you will still get punished the same way that those who outright refuse do. Now, while torture and punishment has been proven to be an effective method of control, to the point where its victims retain the scars and deformities as brutal and severe reminders of who's in charge and who they should listen to, it's not the only method that the entity uses. Next, we'll go into a method that seems to be a lot more gentle, a lot more calm, but in the end is just as devious and malicious. Incentives for willing compliance. Unlike the previous method we discussed, and some of the methods to come, this seems to have the most compassion. No threats, no pain. But this method in itself is drenched in madness. So far, we only know of 2 killers that have been given real incentives for working with the entity. The first being the clown, or Mr. Kenneth Chase. While an argument can be made for Kenneth Chase being put under the category of willing compliance, the amount of benefits he receives in comparison to those killers definitely makes him a candidate for this list. The incentives that he was given is simple, but numerous. First off, his horse Maurice, burnt by the entity and blinded in the process of making it to their realms, was given a third eye and even allowed to travel along with Mr. Kenneth Chase. He was also granted the ability to set up and traverse the realms as he pleases. This is something that the other killers do not have the luxury for, as when they are not in their trials, they are locked into their realms, forced to stay wherever they are if they are not currently working. Kenneth, however, can set up where he so chooses, and that will be where he decides to stay. In the end, quite the incentives indeed. Mr. Chase is able to move around freely, no matter what, and is able to keep his loyal pet with him. Now onto my second favorite killer, or should I say killers, as we will be talking about the Legion, or Frank Morrison, Julie, Susie, and Joey, respectively. Now, when it comes to the Legion, it is quite clear that their group dynamic is their incentive. Unlike other killers, these are 4 individual people who are brought into the entity's realm and work under the moniker of the name Legion. The fact that the group is the incentive is given more credit when you consider that the entity had long since taken its initial target, Frank Morrison, long before Julie, Joey, and Susie came into the picture. All 4 were digging in the muddy snow to dispose of the body when Frank spotted something moving in the woods. He grabbed his knife and broke away from the group to check it out. The fog thickened around Frank, becoming so dense that he could no longer see ahead. He retraced his steps and stumbled onto an ominous path. He followed the eerie path as if called by the darkness. Julie, Susie, and Joey finished digging, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. Julie spotted his muddy footprints in the snow, and the 3 followed the trail, which took them deeper into the woods. When Julie, Susie, and Joey did not return that night, their parents thought they had run away with Frank. Each family came up with different theories. The mood of the town changed, however, when a body was found by an abandoned lodge. By the time these 3 had finished digging to bury the custodian, and had waited for Frank before searching and finding his footsteps, it is very evident that Frank had long since been taken. Maybe a couple of minutes, maybe even longer, but they were definitely lagging behind before the entity snatched them up. It is quite clear that Frank was the entity's intended target. However, it is quite possible that Frank outright refused to work. But instead of torturing, the entity saw more benefit in coercing Frank to work, giving him incentives. By this, it took his Legion members, those who were already obedient to him and would follow. Julie, Susie, and Joey, who were in the process of searching for their leader. Not only did it gain the compliance of Frank and 3 new willing members, it also done this at the cost of nothing. A cleaner, who was still there, grabbed Julie as soon as she came close. A dark impulse took over Frank, and he rushed to her aid, knife in hand, and without hesitation, planted the blade into the cleaner's back. As the group stared at Frank in shock, he ordered them to finish the job. Joey clenched his jaw, grabbed the knife, and stabbed the bleeding man in the ribs. Susie didn't want to do it. Frank shouted at her. They had to finish what they started. Julie closed her eyes and slid the knife into the man's chest. She handed the wet blade to Susie. They were all in this together. Susie stared at Julie in disbelief as Frank grabbed her trembling hands and inserted the knife deep into the man's throat. Frank told them to move fast. They mopped up the blood off the floor and stashed the body into Joey's trunk and drove up to Mount Auburn. Like with many other backstories, the dark impulse that took over Frank could have very easily been the entity, showing that he was the intended target as he initiated the attack without hesitation. However, the others obediently followed, even if some had to be forced to. This made them also prime targets for the entity, as they would do whatever Frank said. So as long as they got Frank, they would be perfect incentives. Frank their incentive, and them Frank's incentive. Quite an interesting predicament our group of hoodlums have been placed into. The entity dangled their group as a juicy carrot to keep them working. You guys do good in your trials, and you guys can hang out when you have free time or are not working. Seems quite the beneficial incentive. Quite a devious method of control indeed. But let's reflect to another one. One that instead of incentives is a contract tied to obligation. Locked into contracts and obligation. This seems to reflect those killers who have made deals with the entity. This, in a way, is a much more beneficial method for the entity. No need to waste time with incentives or torture when somebody is already contracted to work for you. The entity has done almost all the work to keep them in line with just words and promises, which it doesn't even have to commit to in the end. The first victim of this would be the Hag, or better known as Lisa Sherwood. She could go no further. Delirious, she thought of home. She thought of the elders. With her dying breath, she etched the symbols they had taught her into the floor, using what remained of her fingers. Almost in response, a dark hunger stirred within her. It yearned for blood. In oath, she chose vengeance. With nothing left to lose and her dying breath, the hatred, the anger, and the need for revenge all poured into these final symbols. And with that, she made a pact with the entity. And the entity delivered. She got her revenge, and the entity kept its side of the bargain. And Lisa was then dubbed to join the ranks of the killer. Her revenge taken out, she would work for the entity. As it had helped her, so she will help it. Meaning that Lisa is working under obligation, so torture and incentives were not necessary. The next person up is quite a sad case indeed. A young lady who was placed in a similar situation to Lisa, but with much crueler results. Rin Yamaoka, or the Spirit. Coughing up blood, her chin grazed the glass, adding to the bleeding. A low-pitched heartbeat started to ring in her ears. Her body felt so heavy, she couldn't move anymore. The ground shook with her father's footsteps. She knew she wasn't going to make it, but she no longer cared. She wanted to make him pay, in this life or the next. A dark fog slowly veiled her eyes, but it could not subdue her rage. She would not rest, not yet. The darkness whispered, promising blood and revenge. The oath was made, and Rin closed her eyes. Quite similar to Lisa Sherwood, Rin Yamaoka, this young girl made a pact with the entity in her dying breath, filled with the same anger, hatred, and need for revenge that consumed Lisa. Now she works for the entity under the obligation. But unlike Lisa, this is quite different, as it's very well proven that the entity didn't give Rin's revenge. The entity never held to its bargain. Rin's revenge was far more valuable. The deceit and the pact that it had was quite insidious indeed. It dangled a carrot in front of her to make her take a promise, and in return, it didn't satiate its side of the bargain. But Rin is trapped doing hers, an endless spirit seeking revenge, as she can never get the target that she truly wanted to. What a desperate and poor girl. From a method born of such morbid situations, what other outcomes can we expect? Both Lisa and Rin had such terrible instances thrusted upon them, and now they are ruthless killers for the entity. Now, moving on from that, we come to a method that is odd in a way, and that is the killer's own willing compliance to work for the entity.